The morning sun streamed through the airport windows as a well-dressed professional woman walked confidently toward her gate. Her sleek briefcase matched her impeccably pressed navy suit, and her heels clicked purposefully against the terminal floor. After 15 years of building her consulting business, she had earned her place among the corporate elite, with countless successful projects under her belt. Today was just another business trip to Chicago, or so she thought. As she approached the priority boarding line, she couldn't help but notice the subtle glances from fellow passengers. She was used to these looks by now, the quick double takes, the questioning eyes that wondered if she belonged. But she had learned long ago to let their assumptions roll off her back like water. The gate agent barely looked up as she scanned the first-class boarding pass, too busy chatting with her colleague about weekend plans. "Welcome aboard," she said automatically before doing a double take at the premium ticket. Her smile faltered for just a moment, but it was a moment the businesswoman had seen hundreds of times before. Making her way down the jet bridge, she mentally prepared for her upcoming presentation. Her company had just landed a major contract, and this meeting could open doors to even bigger opportunities. Her thoughts were interrupted as she stepped onto the plane, where a flight attendant greeted passengers with practiced cheerfulness. "Oh, first class is to the left," the flight attendant said helpfully, despite the businesswoman already turning that direction. She smiled politely, having learned that grace was often the best response. The first-class cabin gleamed with its wide leather seats and extra legroom, a comfort she had earned through countless miles and late-night flights. As she stored her briefcase in the overhead compartment, she could feel eyes on her. A few passengers shuffled their newspapers or pretended to be absorbed in their phones, but she caught their sideways glances. One older passenger in particular seemed unable to contain his surprise, his eyebrows rising higher as she settled into her window seat. She pulled out her tablet, reviewing her presentation one last time. The cabin slowly filled with other passengers, executives in expensive suits, all seeming to fit someone's idea of what first class should look like. She had earned her seat just like them, through hard work and determination, even if some couldn't see past their preconceptions. The flight attendant passed through, offering pre-flight drinks. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" she asked with forced politeness, despite the businesswoman already having stored her bags and settled in. The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud, one that would soon burst into a storm that would change not just this flight, but spark a conversation that needed to happen. Little did anyone know that what was about to unfold would not only challenge their assumptions, but would become a powerful story of dignity, strength, and change that would resonate with people around the world. The tension in first class was thick enough to cut with a knife. A middle-aged passenger in an expensive suit cleared his throat loudly, shifting in his seat across the aisle. He'd been stealing glances at the businesswoman since she sat down, and now it seemed he couldn't contain himself any longer. "Excuse me," he announced, his voice carrying through the cabin. "I believe you might be confused about your seat assignment." He didn't address her directly, instead looking pointedly at the flight attendant. Other passengers pretended to be absorbed in their phones or magazines, but their attention was clearly focused on the unfolding scene. The businesswoman took a deep breath, her hands steady as she lowered her tablet. She'd faced moments like this before, in boardrooms, at industry conferences, and now here, at 30,000 feet. The familiar mix of exhaustion and frustration washed over her, but she'd learned to channel these emotions into something more powerful. The flight attendant approached, her professional smile wavering. "Ma'am, could I see your boarding pass again?" she asked, despite having already checked it during boarding. The businessman nodded approvingly, as if this was exactly what he wanted. 2 rows ahead, a woman in a red blazer turned around, her face a mix of concern and embarrassment for what was happening. A young professional typing on his laptop paused, his fingers hovering over the keys as he watched the scene unfold. "I've had quite enough business trips to know exactly where my seat is," the businesswoman replied, her voice calm but firm. The strength in her tone made several passengers look up. She reached for her purse, not in hurry or panic, but with deliberate movements that spoke of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The challenging passenger wasn't finished. "Well, I just want to make sure everything is in order," he said, his tone suggesting he was doing everyone a favor. Sometimes these seat assignments can be quite confusing. He gave a condescending laugh that didn't quite mask his true intentions. A tense silence fell over the first-class cabin. The flight attendant stood awkwardly in the aisle, looking between the two passengers. Other travelers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing their own silent complicity in similar situations they'd witnessed before. The businesswoman sat straighter in her seat, her dignity radiating like a shield. What happened next would not only change the atmosphere in that first-class cabin, but would become a moment that thousands would later share, discuss, and learn from. The confrontation was about to transform into something much bigger than a dispute over a seat. It was about to become a powerful lesson about respect, dignity, and standing your ground. The businessman's challenge hung in the air as he demanded to see her boarding pass. "I just think we should verify," he insisted, his voice getting louder. "I fly first class every week, and I know how these mix-ups happen." Several passengers squirmed uncomfortably in their seats, while others started recording discreetly with their phones. The flight attendant seemed torn between protocol and prejudice. "Ma'am, perhaps we could just double-check your boarding pass one more time," she asked, her voice uncertain. The businesswoman noticed how the attendant's eyes kept darting to the businessman, as if seeking his approval. Another flight attendant joined the scene, whispering something to her colleague. The tension in the cabin grew thicker. A few rows back, another passenger stood up, his business suit crisped and his expression concerned. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone suggesting he knew exactly what the problem was. The businesswoman reached into her designer bag with steady hands. Years of facing similar situations had taught her to remain composed. She pulled out not just her boarding pass, but also her executive platinum membership card, her business card from her consulting firm, and her latest speaking engagement invitation from a Fortune 500 company. "Since my credentials are being questioned," she began, her voice clear and controlled, "let me share them all." The way she spoke commanded attention, not through volume, but through dignity. The businessman's face began to redden as she laid out each item on her tray table. A young professional woman across the aisle watched with wide eyes, clearly taking mental notes on how to handle such situations with grace. An elderly couple exchanged knowing looks, perhaps remembering similar battles from their own past. The first flight attendant's face fell as she realized her mistake. The second attendant stepped forward, looking genuinely embarrassed. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry you're dealing with this. You absolutely don't need to prove anything," she said, shooting a disapproving look at her colleague. But the businesswoman wasn't finished. She turned to face the challenging passenger directly, her voice steady and firm. "I earned these miles in boardrooms and conferences across the country. I earned this seat the same way you earned yours. The difference is, I have to prove it every time I sit down." The cabin fell silent. Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth and years of similar experiences. What happened next would not only change the atmosphere on that flight, but would spark a conversation that needed to happen in workplaces and public spaces across the country. The businesswoman's response had shifted the energy in the first-class cabin completely. Her stack of credentials lay on the tray table like a royal flush in a high-stakes poker game. The executive platinum card caught the cabin light, gleaming like a badge of honor. "I have presented my credentials," she continued, her voice steady and clear. "Now I'd like to present something else, a moment of education." She turned to face the entire cabin, including those who had pretended not to notice the confrontation. "Every time someone like me achieves success, we carry an extra burden. We don't just represent ourselves, we represent every person who looks like us." The challenging passenger shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence deflating like a punctured balloon. Other passengers had stopped pretending to be busy with their phones and laptops. They were listening now, really listening. A seasoned business executive 2 rows ahead stood up. "I've seen this happen too many times," he declared. "I fly first class every week too, and I've watched people make the same assumptions. It needs to stop." His words carried the weight of someone who had witnessed similar scenes play out countless times. The second flight attendant stepped forward again. "On behalf of the airline, I want to apologize sincerely," she said, her voice genuine. "This isn't what we stand for, and this isn't the experience any of our passengers should have." The businesswoman gathered her credentials with deliberate movements. "I accept your apology," she said, "but I want this moment to mean something more." She pulled out her phone and opened her social media app. "This isn't about shame or blame. It's about awareness and change." The young professional woman across the aisle spoke up. "Would you mind if I shared your story too? People need to hear this." Others in the cabin nodded in agreement, their faces showing a mix of respect and understanding. As the plane began its final preparations for takeoff, the atmosphere in first class had transformed. What began as an attempt to challenge one woman's right to be there had become a powerful lesson in dignity, respect, and the ongoing journey toward true equality. The challenging passenger remained silent now, staring straight ahead, perhaps reflecting on his own role in perpetuating outdated assumptions. The incident was over, but its impact was just beginning to ripple outward, soon to reach far beyond the confines of this first-class cabin. As the plane reached cruising altitude, something remarkable started happening in the first-class cabin. The businesswoman's phone buzzed quietly. Her social media post was already gaining traction. But what was happening in the cabin itself was even more powerful. 2 business executives who had witnessed everything approached her seat. "That was incredibly handled," one said quietly. "I'm ashamed to say I've been silent in similar situations before." "Not anymore." The other nodded in agreement, handing her his business card. "We need voices like yours at our next corporate leadership summit." The flight attendant who had initially questioned her credentials returned, this time with tears in her eyes. "I've been in this job for 15 years, she confessed, "and I never realized how my own biases were affecting my behavior. Thank you for teaching me something today." Other passengers began sharing their own stories, turning the first-class cabin into an impromptu forum for honest dialogue. A retired teacher spoke about similar experiences in academia. A young tech professional shared how she often faced the same assumptions in Silicon Valley boardrooms. The businessman who had started the confrontation remained quiet, but his body language had changed completely. He was listening, really listening, perhaps for the first time. The shame on his face had transformed into something that looked more like understanding. The businesswoman's phone kept lighting up with notifications. Her post had struck a chord, spreading rapidly across professional networks. Comments were pouring in from people sharing similar experiences, thanking her for speaking up, for standing her ground with such grace and dignity. A group of flight attendants gathered briefly near the galley, and soon the head flight attendant approached with an announcement. "We're implementing an immediate review of our training procedures," she declared. "What happened today has opened our eyes. Change starts with acknowledging where we've gone wrong." The businesswoman looked out the window at the clouds below, reflecting on how a simple business trip had turned into something so much bigger. She thought about all the others who had faced similar situations but hadn't been able to speak up. Today's stand wasn't just for her. It was for all of them. Back on solid ground at Chicago O'Hare, the businesswoman pulled out her phone and began crafting a careful message. She wasn't interested in calling anyone out or spreading negativity. Instead, she focused on turning this experience into a teaching moment. "Today, something happened that we need to talk about," she typed. "Not to shame, but to learn." She described the incident, highlighting not just the challenge she faced, but the powerful way other passengers eventually stood up for what was right. Her social media post was already gaining momentum. CEOs, business leaders, and professionals from various industries were sharing it, adding their own experiences and pledges to do better. Major news outlets started reaching out, sensing a story that could spark important conversations about workplace discrimination and travel bias. The comments section filled with stories from others who had faced similar situations. A doctor wrote about being mistaken for a nurse repeatedly. An attorney shared how security often stopped her at courthouse entrances, assuming she was a client rather than a lawyer. Each story added another thread to a larger tapestry of shared experiences. Corporate training experts started sharing the post, using it as a real-world example of how unconscious bias appears in everyday situations. Diversity consultants reached out, asking permission to use this story in their workshops. What started as one woman's stand was becoming a catalyst for change. Airlines began sharing internal memos about reviewing their training procedures. The original post had exposed a blind spot in customer service that needed addressing. Other companies followed suit, recognizing that this wasn't just about airlines. It was about challenging assumptions in every professional space. The businesswoman's inbox filled with speaking invitations from companies eager to learn from her experience. But what touched her most were the messages from young professionals thanking her for showing them how to handle such situations with dignity and strength. Her stand wasn't just changing policies, it was empowering others to speak up too. Within 48 hours, the businesswoman's story had exploded across social media platforms. Her LinkedIn post alone had gathered over 1 million views, with thousands of shares from industry leaders and professionals worldwide. Major news networks were running the story in their primetime slots, sparking nationwide discussions about discrimination in professional spaces. Corporate leaders began reaching out one after another. A tech giant's CEO personally called to discuss incorporating her experience into their company-wide training program. Wall Street firms wanted her to speak at their diversity summits. Her inbox was flooded with requests from organizations eager to learn from her experience. The airline's response went viral too. Instead of a standard corporate apology, they announced a complete overhaul of their training procedures. They invited her to be part of their advisory board, recognizing that real change needed voices like hers at the decision-making table. Professional groups started sharing similar stories that had gone unnoticed before. Flight attendants came forward with their own experiences of witnessing discrimination, vowing to do better. Business travelers shared their stories, creating a powerful ripple effect across industries. The most touching responses came from young professionals who saw themselves in her story. "I've always stayed quiet when faced with discrimination," one wrote. "You showed me how to stand up with dignity." Another shared how they'd printed her story to keep as a reminder of how to handle such situations with grace. Social justice organizations reached out for partnerships, seeing how her approach, firm but educational rather than confrontational, could create lasting change. Educational institutions requested permission to use her story in their business ethics courses, recognizing its value in teaching future leaders. The original challenging passenger even reached out through the airline, requesting to apologize personally and share how the incident had changed his perspective. His message spoke of deep reflection and a commitment to challenging his own biases. The airline's corporate response surpassed everyone's expectations. Their CEO personally appeared in a video addressing the incident, announcing a comprehensive plan for change. It wasn't just about adding another training module. They were rebuilding their entire approach to customer service and inclusivity from the ground up. "We're not just apologizing," the CEO stated in a widely shared press release. "We're transforming our entire company culture." They announced a partnership with leading diversity experts to create new training programs, with the businesswoman serving as a key consultant on the project. The training program they developed together was groundbreaking. Instead of typical corporate videos, it used real stories and interactive scenarios. Flight attendants and gate agents participated in workshops that challenged their unconscious biases. The program quickly became a model for other airlines and service industries. Other major companies took notice. Hotels, restaurants, and retail chains began reaching out, asking how they could implement similar changes. The businesswoman found herself at the center of a movement for corporate cultural change, her experience becoming a catalyst for improvement across multiple industries. The airline's board of directors invited her to join the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. They wanted her perspective on everything from employee training to customer service policies. Her voice in the boardroom represented countless others who had faced similar situations but hadn't been heard. Traditional business publications picked up the story, but with a different angle. They focused on how standing up for principles could lead to positive corporate change. Harvard Business Review requested an article about turning discriminatory experiences into opportunities for institutional improvement. The most significant change came from within the airline's own ranks. Employees began sharing their own stories of witnessing discrimination, creating a powerful internal movement for change. The company established a new reporting system for bias incidents, encouraging staff to speak up when they saw something wrong. 1 year after the incident, the businesswoman stood on a TED Talk stage, sharing how a confrontation in first class had sparked a movement. The auditorium was packed with corporate leaders, activists, and young professionals eager to learn from her experience. Change doesn't always come from grand gestures, she began. Sometimes it comes from simply refusing to move from your rightful place. Her words resonated through the hall, touching everyone who had ever felt out of place in spaces they'd earned the right to occupy. Her consulting firm had grown into something bigger, a full-fledged organization dedicated to workplace inclusion. Companies didn't just want her to speak anymore, they wanted her to transform their cultures. She had trained over 10,000 employees across various industries, from airlines to tech giants. The airline's training program had become a case study in business schools. Students discussed how one person's stand for dignity had led to institutional change. The story had found its way into textbooks, teaching future business leaders about the importance of inclusive leadership. Young professionals frequently approached her at conferences, sharing how her story had given them courage. "I used your words in a meeting last week," one young consultant told her. "I stood my ground, just like you did." These moments reminded her why sharing her story mattered. The original viral post had evolved into a published book about dignity in professional spaces. It wasn't just her story anymore. It included voices from people who had faced similar challenges and overcome them. The book became required reading in many corporate training programs. Most importantly, she noticed real change happening. First-class cabins became more diverse. Companies started paying attention to subtle forms of discrimination. People were more willing to speak up when they witnessed bias, creating a ripple effect of positive change. Her journey had become a blueprint for turning difficult moments into opportunities for growth. As she concluded her TED Talk, she shared one final thought. Success isn't just about reaching the top. It's about holding the door open for others to follow, making sure everyone has a seat at the table, or in this case, on the plane.